Use headphones for the best experience.
My grandfather died on a Tuesday in November, and by Thursday I was standing in his house in Harlan County, Kentucky, trying to figure out what to do with 60 years of a life I'd only ever seen the edges of. His name was Earl Pruitt. He was 81. He'd lived alone in a wood frame house on a county road outside of Everett since before I was born. And in all the years I knew him, I never once saw him leave the property. Not for groceries. Those were delivered by a man in a white truck every Wednesday. Not for church. He didn't go. Not for holidays. We came to him, or we didn't see him. When I was young, I thought this was just how old people in Appalachia lived. When I got older, I assumed it was stubbornness, or grief over my grandmother's death, or some form of agoraphobia he was too proud to name. My mother never explained it. When I asked, she'd say, "Your grandfather has his reasons," in a tone that meant the conversation was over. I drove down from Lexington the day after he died. My mother couldn't make the trip. Her knees had gotten bad enough that the 3-hour drive was out of the question, and she'd never learned to fly, and in any case, she'd said on the phone that she wasn't sure she wanted to go back to that house. She didn't say why. She just asked me to handle it. Clean it out, talk to the lawyer about the property, bring back anything personal. She said this in the flat, practical voice she used when she was feeling something she didn't want to discuss. The house was smaller than I remembered. White clapboard, green roof, a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. It sat at the end of a gravel drive, backed up against a tree line that marked the beginning of a hollow that ran deep into the hills. The yard was neat, mowed recently, flower beds along the front cleared for winter. Whoever had been helping my grandfather maintain the place had done good work. The house looked cared for. It looked lived in. It didn't look like the house of a man who had just died. Inside, it was the same. Clean, orderly, warm. The wood stove in the front room had been banked but still held coals. There were dishes in the drying rack by the sink. 1 plate, 1 cup, 1 fork, washed and set out to dry. A pair of reading glasses on the kitchen table next to a folded newspaper. The newspaper was dated the day he died. He'd been reading it that morning. He'd eaten breakfast. He'd washed his dishes. And then, according to the coroner, he'd sat down in the chair by the wood stove. And his heart had stopped. And that was it. I walked through the rooms. Slowly. The house had 3 bedrooms. The master, which still had my grandmother's quilt on the bed even though she'd been dead for 30 years. A spare room that had been converted into a storage space, stacked with labeled boxes. And a small room at the back of the house past the kitchen that I remembered as my grandfather's office. The office door was closed. I opened it and stepped inside and found what I'd expected. A desk, a chair, a filing cabinet, shelves of books, mostly agricultural manuals, county histories, a King James Bible with a cracked spine. The room smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper. There was a window that looked out at the tree line, and through it I could see the hollow stretching back into the hills, dark and deep even in the middle of the day. On the desk, centered, as if it had been placed there deliberately, was a journal. It was a composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind you'd buy at a drugstore. It was thick, swollen slightly from years of use, the cover soft and curling at the corners. A rubber band held it shut. My grandfather's name was written on the front in his careful, angular handwriting. Earl Pruitt, personal record. I sat down at the desk and opened it. The first entry was dated March 3rd, 1962. It read, "Saw it again last night. 3rd time this week. Standing at the tree line just past where the yard light reaches. Same spot as before. Margaret says I should stop looking out the window after dark. She might be right, but it doesn't do anything. It just stands there. I don't think it knows I can see it." I turned the page. March 7th, 1962. It knows I can see it. Last night it was closer. Not by much. Maybe 10 feet from where it was before. Margaret didn't see it, and I didn't tell her. She's 7 months along, and I don't want her worrying. I watched it for about an hour before I went to bed. It didn't move the whole time, but when I looked out the window this morning, there were marks in the grass where it had been. not footprints. Depressions, like something heavy had been set down and left there long enough to kill the grass underneath. I want to be careful about what I say next because I know how it sounds. I sat in my grandfather's office and I read the journal front to back. It took me 4 hours. The entry spanned 62 years, from 1962 to 3 days before he died. Some years had dozens of entries. Some had only a few. But the subject never changed. Something lived in the hollow behind the house. My grandfather had been watching it for his entire adult life, and it had been watching him. The early entries, the 60s and 70s, read like a man trying to make sense of something through careful observation. He noted the dates it appeared, the weather, the moon phase, the position relative to the tree line. He sketched rough maps of its movements over time. He was methodical, almost scientific, the way a farmer tracks a pest or a predator. He didn't name it. He called it the visitor or it, or sometimes just drew a small mark in the margin, a circle with a line through it, as shorthand. The visitor appeared at night, always at the tree line, always facing the house. It never approached during these early years. It simply stood there, at the edge of where the yard light reached, and watched. My grandfather described its shape as tall, narrow, wrong in a way I can't pin down. He wrote once that it looked like a man the way a scarecrow looks like a man. The proportions were there, but the intention behind them was absent. In 1964, my mother was born. The entries from that year had a different quality, more urgent. The visitor appeared more frequently after the birth, almost every night for 2 weeks straight. My grandfather bought a rifle and sat on the porch 3 nights running, watching the tree line. On the 3rd night, he wrote, "It's still there. I sat with the rifle across my knees for 4 hours. It didn't move. I didn't shoot. I don't know what stopped me. Something in the way it stands. It's not the right word. It's attentive, like it's waiting for something specific to happen. And until that thing happens, it's content to wait. I don't want to find out what it's waiting for." In 1967, something changed. The entry was dated October 14th. Margaret found the marks. She was hanging laundry and she saw the dead patches in the grass near the tree line and she asked me what made them. I told her deer. She didn't believe me. That night she looked out the window and she saw it. She was calm, calmer than I expected. She looked at it for a long time and then she turned to me and said, "How long?" And I said, 5 years. And she nodded like I'd confirmed something she already knew. She said her mother had told her about something in the hollow when she was a girl. She said her mother called it the one who keeps the count. I asked her what that meant. She said she didn't know. Her mother wouldn't explain. She just said, "Don't go into the hollow, and don't invite it closer, and it won't bother you none." I stopped reading for a while after that entry. I went to the kitchen and made coffee with the supplies still in my grandfather's cupboard, and stood at the window and looked at the yard and the tree line beyond it. It was early afternoon. The hollow was visible as a dark crease in the hillside, thick with bare hardwoods and the last brown leaves of autumn. It looked like any other hollow in Harlan County. It looked like nothing. I went back to the journal. Through the 70s and 80s, the entries settled into a pattern. The visitor appeared regularly, 2 or 3 times a week in warm months, less often in winter. My grandfather watched it. It watched the house. Nothing happened. The entries became shorter, more routine, almost like weather observations. November 3rd, 1978. Visitor present. Tree line, 11 p.m. Clear sky. No movement. Gone by dawn. He was logging it the way you'd log rainfall. Something that was part of the property's reality, as natural and unchosen as the slope of the land. But in 1983, the entries changed again. My grandmother, Margaret, had been diagnosed with cancer. The entries from that year barely mentioned the visitor. They were about her treatments, her pain, the drives to the hospital in Harlan, the slow process of losing her. She died in January 1984. The entry from that night read, "I am alone in the house for the first time in 22 years. I don't know what to do with myself. I sat on the porch after the funeral home took her and I looked at the tree line, and it was there, and for the first time it was not standing still. It was moving, slowly, side to side like a man pacing, like it was agitated, or grieving. I don't know how to interpret that, and I don't want to. The next entry was 3 weeks later. I don't know why. I was standing in the yard in the afternoon, and I looked at the place where it always stands, and I walked toward it. I didn't plan to. I just started walking. I stopped at the edge of the trees. I could see the hollow stretching back into the hill, the creek bed at the bottom, the old growth on the far slope. And I could feel something. Not a presence. Not a sound. A pull, the same pull you feel standing at the edge of deep water. Not a desire to jump, but an awareness that jumping is possible, and that the water is deep, and that it would close over you completely. I stepped back. I went inside. I closed the door. I will not go to the tree line again. He kept that promise. For the next 20 years, the entries recorded the visitor's appearances without any mention of approaching it. My grandfather lived alone, maintained the house, kept his garden, and watched the tree line at night the way a lighthouse keeper watches the sea, not because he expected anything to change, but because watching was his function. It was what he did. I was born in 1990. My mother had moved to Lexington in the 80s and married my father, and I grew up 3 hours north of Harlan County, visiting my grandfather 2 or 3 times a year. The entries from the 90s mentioned me occasionally. June 15th, 1996. Thomas and Linda visited. The boy is getting tall. He asked why I never leave the house. I told him I like it here. He didn't believe me. Smart kid. And once, in 1998, the boy was playing in the yard today, near the tree line. I called him back. He asked why. I said the ticks are bad this year. He came back. The visitor was not present during the day, but when they left and it got dark, it was there, and it was not in its usual spot. It was 15 feet closer to the house than I've ever seen it. I don't know if that's because of the boy. That entry made me put the journal down and sit very still for a while. I picked it up again. The entries from the 2000s were sparser. My grandfather was in his 70s. The handwriting was still steady but smaller, more economical. The visitor came and went. Nothing changed, and then, in 2011, there was an entry that ran 3 full pages, the longest in the journal. October 9th, 2011. Something has happened that I need to write down carefully because I'm not sure I understand it, and I want to have it recorded in case I never understand it. Last night, the visitor was at the tree line as usual. I was sitting in the front room by the stove, and I looked out the window around midnight, and it was there. I've been watching it for 49 years. In all that time, it has never done anything but stand and watch. Last night, for the first time, it spoke. I was born in 1990. My mother had moved to Lexington in the 80s and married my father, and I grew up 3 hours north of Harlan County, visiting my grandfather 2 or 3 times a year. The entries from the 90s mentioned me occasionally. June 15th, 1996. Thomas and Linda visited. The boy is getting tall. He asked why I never leave the house. I told him I like it here. He didn't believe me. Smart kid. And once, in 1998, the boy was playing in the yard today, near the tree line. I called him back. He asked why. I said the ticks are bad this year. He came back. The visitor was not present during the day, but when they left and it got dark, it was there, and it was not in its usual spot. It was 15 feet closer to the house than I've ever seen it. I don't know if that's because of the boy. That entry made me put the journal down and sit very still for a while. I picked it up again. The entries from the 2000s were sparser. My grandfather was in his 70s. The handwriting was still steady but smaller, more economical. The visitor came and went. Nothing changed, and then, in 2011, there was an entry that ran 3 full pages, the longest in the journal. October 9th, 2011. Something has happened that I need to write down carefully because I'm not sure I understand it, and I want to have it recorded in case I never understand it. Last night, the visitor was at the tree line as usual. I was sitting in the front room by the stove, and I looked out the window around midnight, and it was there. I've been watching it for 49 years. In all that time, it has never done anything but stand and watch. Last night, for the first time, it spoke. Not out loud. I didn't hear a voice. I was looking at it through the window, and a thought appeared in my mind that was not my thought. I know my thoughts. I've lived with them for 76 years. This thought was not mine. It felt like a sentence placed on a table in front of me. Clear. Complete, not attached to any emotion or memory of my own. The thought was, the count is almost done. Then I thought, deliberately, as clearly as I could, what count? And the answer came, the years. I asked, how many years? And it said, as many as she gave. She lived to 52. I don't know what was given or to whom or why the years need counting, but I know this. The visitor is not hostile. I've known that for a long time, but last night it became something closer to certainty. It isn't here to harm me. It's here to keep track of something, and when the tracking is done, it will do whatever it came to do, and not before. I'm not afraid I should be, but I've been watching it for so long that fear doesn't describe what I feel anymore. What I feel is closer to what you'd feel sitting across from someone who's been waiting patiently in your living room for half a century, and you've never asked them what they want, and they've never volunteered it, and you've both just accepted the arrangement. I think the arrangement is almost over. The remaining entries were brief, one every few months. The visitor appeared, the visitor was noted, the handwriting grew a little shakier each year. The second to last entry was dated 11 days before his death, November 1st. Visitor present, closer again, maybe 20 feet from the porch now, the closest it's ever been. I can see more detail than before, but I'm not going to describe it. Some things you shouldn't put into words because the words make them more real than they need to be. I will say this, it's not what I thought it was. It's not a creature. It's not a spirit. It's a function. It does a thing the way a river does a thing. And the thing is almost done. The last entry was dated 3 days after my grandfather died. I need you to understand that. The last entry in my grandfather's journal, the journal that was sitting on his desk when I arrived, the journal written in his handwriting, was dated 3 days after his death. The coroner confirmed the date. He died on Tuesday, November 12th. The last entry was dated November 15th. Friday. It was the day I arrived. The entry read, "The boy is here. He drove down from Lexington this morning. He's in the kitchen making coffee. He'll find this journal soon. He'll read it. He'll go to the window and look at the tree line, and he'll see what I've seen. And he'll understand what his grandmother understood, and what his great-grandmother understood before her. The count is done. 52 years, one for every year Margaret lived. That was the arrangement. I didn't make it. She did before I ever knew her, before her mother told her what lived in the hollow. The women in this family have always known. They make the offering, and the thing in the hollow keeps count, and when the count is done, it comes to collect. It's not going to hurt him. That's not what it does. It's going to show him the hollow. And he's going to walk in, and he's going to understand why his grandmother made the bargain, and what it cost, and what it bought. And then he's going to have a choice. I never had the choice. I was just the counter, the watcher, the one who sat in the house and made sure the count was kept honestly, year by year, night by night. That was my function. And it's done. The boy gets to choose. I hope he chooses well. I put the journal down. The kitchen was quiet. The coffee was cold in my hand. Through the window, the tree line was dark against the gray November sky, and the hollow beyond it was a shadowed crease in the hillside. And standing at the edge of the trees in the exact spot my grandfather had described in hundreds of entries over 62 years, there was something. It was tall. It was narrow. It was still. And it was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as patient. I stood at the window for a long time. It didn't move. I didn't move. The house was quiet around me, and the wood stove ticked as the coals cooled, and outside the wind moved through the bare trees in the hollow with a sound like slow breathing. I understood, standing there, what my grandfather had meant when he wrote that it wasn't a creature. It didn't feel like a creature. It felt like a boundary, a marker, the way a fence post marks the line between your land and whatever's beyond it. It was standing where it had always stood, because that's where the line was, and the line was real, and what was on the other side of it was real. And the only question that had ever mattered, was whether I'd cross it. I haven't crossed it. Not yet. I've been staying in the house for 5 days now. I told my mother I needed more time to sort through everything. She didn't argue. I think she knows. I think she's always known, the way her mother knew, the way her grandmother knew. And she left Harlan County not because of the roads or the jobs or the life, but because she was afraid of exactly this. The choice arriving the way it always arrives, at the tree line, in the hollow, in the family. I go to the window every night. It's there. It's always there. And here's what I haven't been able to explain to anyone because there's no one to explain it to. Looking at it doesn't feel like looking at something dangerous. It feels like looking at the answer to a question I didn't know I'd been asking. It feels like the pull my grandfather described, not the desire to jump, but the awareness that the water is deep and that it has been waiting, and that it is not cold. Every night, it's a little closer to the porch, and every night the pull is a little more like a direction than a feeling. I haven't called my mother. I haven't gone back to Lexington. The journal is on the desk and the coffee is cold, and the hollow is dark and deep, and the thing at the tree line is patient, and I am beginning to understand that the choice isn't really between going and staying. The choice is between knowing and not knowing. And I've already read the journal. I already know too much to go back to a life where the hollow is just a hollow and the tree line is just trees. My grandfather watched for 62 years and never crossed the line. But he wasn't given the choice. I am. And the thing that terrifies me, more than the visitor, more than the hollow, more than whatever my grandmother traded 52 years of counting for, is that I'm not sure the answer I'm leaning toward is no.